It began with a mistake at closing time. I was the last person left in the local library that evening, a small building tucked between an abandoned post office and a crumbling church. The air inside always smelled faintly of dust and old paper. It wasn't the kind of place anyone lingered after sunset. The fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, the kind of hum that sank into your bones if you stayed too long. I had been researching old property records for a project and hadn't noticed how late it was until the computer screen dimmed automatically. I gathered my notes and walked toward the front desk to check out the books I borrowed. That was when I first noticed her, the librarian. She was sitting perfectly still behind the counter, hands folded neatly in front of her. I hadn't seen her before. She wasn't the usual old man who managed the late shift. Her skin was pale, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones, and her hair was tied back so tightly it made her face seem almost too still. But what I remember most were her eyes. They were open wide, uncomfortably wide, and they didn't move when I approached. She didn't blink. Not once. I hesitated before placing the books on the counter. Her gaze never shifted, never softened. It was as if she wasn't really looking at me, but through me. When I told her the titles, she nodded slowly, her mouth forming a faint curve that wasn't quite a smile. She took my library card with a deliberate slowness that made the air feel heavy. Then she leaned forward slightly, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw her pupils contract, not in response to light, but as if focusing on something behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. She handed the card back without a word. I took my books, murmured a thanks, and hurried to the door. Just before I stepped outside, I glanced back over my shoulder. She was still sitting there, still staring, still not blinking. The door closed behind me with a soft thud, and only then did I realize my palms were sweating. That night, I dreamed of her. The dream was silent, like an old film reel, but the details were too sharp to feel like dreams should. I stood in the middle of the library, surrounded by endless rows of books, but all the pages were blank. And at the far end, beneath the flickering light, the librarian sat motionless. Her eyes were fixed on me, wide and glassy, reflecting the dim light like polished marble. When I woke, my bedroom felt wrong. My curtains were drawn, yet the faintest light seeped through the gaps, white and cold like the lamps from the library. My books on the desk had been moved, the same ones I had borrowed the night before. They were now stacked in a perfect column, aligned with unnatural precision. I didn't remember arranging them like that. The next day, I told myself it was exhaustion, that maybe I was overthinking it. But something in me felt uneasy enough to return the books early. When I stepped into the library that afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, and everything looked ordinary again. The smell of paper and old wood filled the air. The man who usually worked there greeted me, smiling in the way small-town librarians always do. I asked him about the woman who'd been working last night, and the smile fell from his face. He told me no one else had been on shift. For a moment, I thought he was joking, but his expression didn't change. He insisted he had locked up himself. He said no one had worked late in years. Budget cuts and staffing shortages had made sure of that. When I described her, his face went pale. He told me quietly that years ago, a woman named Mrs. Weaver had worked there as the night librarian. She'd been found one morning still seated behind the front desk, her eyes wide open, her body rigid as though frozen in place. They said she died of a sudden aneurysm, but no one could explain why her eyes had remained open. The library was quiet for a long time after that conversation. Even the air seemed to shift, heavier somehow. I left quickly, but as I reached the door, I turned back once more. The far corner of the library, behind the front desk, was dim. A figure sat there, unmoving, her face pale in the gloom. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but she didn't blink. And as the door closed behind me again, I could swear I heard the faint scrape of a chair being pulled across the floor. After that day, I tried to stay away from the library, but something about it kept pressing against the back of my thoughts like a persistent hand. Every night, I'd see flashes of her in the dark. The wide eyes, the stiff posture, the airless stillness. I'd wake up gasping, convinced someone was standing beside the bed, watching. Yet each time I turned on the light, I was alone. A week later, I convinced myself to return, thinking that facing the place again might dissolve the unease. The building looked the same as ever, the same chipped signs swinging in the breeze, the same heavy doors that groaned when pushed open. Inside, the light felt dimmer than I remembered. Dust floated lazily in the beams from the high windows. The librarian on duty that afternoon was a young woman I hadn't seen before. She gave me a polite nod, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. I made my way to the local history section where I'd spent most of my evenings before all of this started. The smell of paper and polish hung thick in the air, strangely sweet and metallic. I settled into one of the small wooden tables and opened an old property register. The pages crackled softly as I turned them. Every sound in the room felt amplified, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the lights. At some point, I noticed the air around me shift. The hairs on my arms lifted as though the temperature had dropped. Then, between two rows of shelves, I caught a flicker of movement. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see another patron, but no one was there. The aisle stretched empty and silent. I stared for several seconds before returning to my book, but as soon as I did, I felt it again, that unmistakable weight of someone's eyes fixed on me. When I glanced up, I saw her. Halfway down the aisle stood the same woman from that night. Pale skin, tied back hair, eyes open too wide, reflecting the faint overhead light. She wasn't moving, only standing between the shelves as if she'd been there all along. I froze, unable to breathe. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The librarian at the front desk didn't seem to notice. She was typing on a computer, humming quietly to herself. Then, in one slow motion, the woman between the shelves tilted her head. The movement was slight, deliberate, unnatural. I blinked, and she was gone. I stumbled to my feet, the chair screeching against the floor. The young librarian looked up, startled. I told her someone had just been standing there. She frowned, got up, and followed me to the aisle. It was empty. She assured me no one else had entered, but there was something on the floor between shelves. A small library card, old and yellowed with age. The name printed on it was Mrs. Weaver. The young librarian didn't seem to notice. I slipped it into my pocket, unsure why I didn't hand it over. As I left the building, the late afternoon sun felt wrong, too bright, too cold. The world outside seemed drained of sound. That night, I examined the card under my desk lamp. The letters looked handwritten even though they should have been printed. And as I stared, the ink began to change. Slowly, the name faded until only the faint outline of letters remained. Beneath it, new words began to appear. Return what was taken. My hands trembled. I dropped the card, but when I bent to pick it up, it was blank again. Just a piece of yellowing paper. I barely slept. Every time my eyes closed, I heard pages turning somewhere in the dark. At one point, I could swear I heard footsteps just outside my bedroom door, slow, measured, deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, came another sound. Breathing. Shallow, steady, only a few feet away. When I finally turned on the light, the room was empty. But my desk drawer was open, and the library card was lying in the center. The next morning, I drove back to the library, desperate to understand what was happening. The young librarian wasn't there, and neither was the old man. The building was almost empty except for one patron sitting in the far corner reading. I went straight to the front desk, determined to ask about Mrs. Weaver. But when I reached it, someone was already sitting there. It was her. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her. Her eyes locked on mine, unblinking. Her expression didn't change when I froze mid-step. The air grew dense, muffling every sound. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke, her voice dry and level, like paper being torn slowly. "You kept the books too long." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. She leaned forward just slightly, her eyes reflecting the fluorescent light in a way that made her face look hollow. Before I could move, before I could even blink, she whispered again, "There's always a price for forgetting to return what you borrowed." I turned and ran. The doors opened too slowly. The last thing I saw before the light of day hit me was her face, pale, frozen, staring, watching me leave without blinking once. That night, I began hearing the rustle of pages again. Only this time, it wasn't in my dreams. It came from the closet, from inside the walls. And sometimes, just before the sound began, I could feel a pair of eyes open somewhere in the dark. For several days, I avoided sleep. Every time my eyes closed, I felt her presence gathering just beyond the edges of my awareness. The air in my apartment began to change. It smelled faintly of dust and dry paper, like the library's old basement. The sound of turning pages came more frequently, always faint at first, then louder, closer, until I'd snap awake and the room would be silent again. I decided to return to the library one last time, not to confront her, but to end it somehow. It was a strange kind of logic that guided me there, a pull I couldn't ignore. The building looked darker than usual when I arrived, even though it was early afternoon. The windows reflected nothing, as if the sunlight refused to enter. Inside, the usual brightness was gone. The air was cold and still. There was no one at the front desk, no distant footsteps from other patrons. Only silence. I moved slowly through the aisles, feeling watched from every direction. The lights overhead flickered, humming faintly like something buried deep underground. At the far end of the building, behind a heavy door marked staff only, I found a narrow hallway that I'd never noticed before. The door was unlocked. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed, except for a faint trail of footprints leading inward. My chest tightened, but I followed. The hallway led to a small room lit by a single hanging bulb that swung slightly, though there was no wind. In the center of the room was a desk covered in stacks of catalog cards. Most were yellowed, some were torn, all covered in names. Thousands of them, handwritten in neat, deliberate strokes. I ran my fingers over the top of one pile. Each card had a name, a date, and a note that read checked out, not returned. One of the cards caught my eye. The handwriting was familiar. My own name. I felt the blood drain from my body. The note beneath my name read, "Simply Pending Collection." As I stared at it, I heard movement behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, the scrape of shoes on concrete. I turned, and there she was, the librarian, Mrs. Weaver. Her face was the same as before, pale and stretched tight, eyes wide open, the pupils deep and endless. She didn't speak at first. She only watched. Her stillness made the light bulb sway harder, shadows shifting across her face until it looked almost hollow. When she finally moved, it was in small, precise motions, her head tilting slightly to one side as though studying me. "You have borrowed more than books." Her voice came from everywhere at once, soft, distant, dry as parchment. I backed away, my legs unsteady. She stepped forward, her gaze never breaking. Her eyes seemed to absorb light, drinking it in. She reached out a thin hand toward the table. The cards began to stir as if caught in a breath of wind. They lifted slightly, fluttering, then settled again. The top card, the one with my name, slid off the stack and drifted toward her. She held it between two fingers, studying it as though reading something invisible written there. Then she looked up at me. It must be returned. I turned to run, but the hallway behind me was gone. The door had disappeared. In its place was another row of shelves, towering, endless, lined with books so old their titles had faded. The air grew thicker. I stumbled backward, knocking over a pile of cards that scattered across the floor. For a brief second, I glanced at one of them. It bore another name I recognized, Henry Dalton, the old man who used to run the evening shifts. The note beneath his name read "Collected." I fell to my knees, struggling to breathe. The lights dimmed further, and the room began to hum. The same electric tone I'd heard in my apartment. Mrs. Weaver took another step forward, her movements jerky now, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. I shouted that I hadn't taken anything, that I just wanted to leave. She stopped, staring, her unblinking eyes reflecting my shape distorted and small within them. She raised her other hand, and from somewhere deep within the shelves came a sound like whispering, hundreds of voices speaking at once, too quiet to understand, but full of urgency. The sound swelled until it filled the room, echoing against the walls, pressing into my head. The whispering stopped abruptly. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite hers anymore, she spoke again. "Every borrower must become part of the record." I reached for the card with my name, trying to tear it, but the paper felt wrong, thicker, almost alive. The letters shifted beneath my fingers, spelling words I didn't understand. When I looked up again, she was gone. The light bulb flickered violently, then went out. I was alone in the dark. I don't remember leaving. Somehow, I found myself outside, gasping in the afternoon air. My hands were shaking. In my pocket, I found the same card, the one with my name on it. The ink was smeared now, but the words "pending collection" were still legible. That night, the sound of turning pages returned louder than ever. They came from inside the walls, from behind the mirrors, from the corners of my mind that light couldn't reach. And when I looked in the mirror just before dawn, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. I hadn't blinked in over a minute. The next few days passed in fragments. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering messages. The world outside my apartment had grown distant, drained of color, muffled like it existed behind glass. All I could focus on was the card. It lay on my desk where I had left it, its corners soft and worn now, the ink growing darker each time I looked at it. The words seemed to move when I wasn't watching. Sometimes I thought I saw a faint pulse ripple through the paper, as if something inside it were alive and breathing. The sound of turning pages had become constant. I'd wake in the night to find my books rearranged into strange patterns, sometimes stacked in tall, narrow towers that threatened to fall if I breathed too hard. Other times they were open to random pages, the same phrase underlined again and again. Return what was taken. By the fourth night, I realized the sound was no longer just coming from the walls. It was coming from below, from under the floorboards. At first I tried to ignore it, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, drove me to follow it. I moved my desk aside and knelt, pressing my ear to the floor. The faint rustle of pages was joined by another sound, breathing, slow and rhythmic, in perfect time with my own. Then came the soft scrape of nails or fingers against wood. When I lifted my head, the library card had moved. It now lay directly beneath the crack in the floorboards. And next to it, faint but visible, was a second card. This one bore no name, just a single word scrawled in uneven handwriting. Below, I don't remember deciding to go back to the library. I only remember standing outside it again in the cold evening air, watching the windows. No light shone from inside, yet the doors were unlocked. The moment I stepped in, I knew something had changed. The smell of paper and dust was heavier, almost damp. The air seemed to thrum, as if the entire building was breathing in time with me. My footsteps sounded too loud as I crossed the floor toward the staff hallway. The same staff-only door stood slightly ajar, and beyond it the same narrow corridor stretched ahead. But at the end of it, where the catalog room should have been, a staircase now descended into darkness. I stood there for a long time, staring down at the first step. It looked impossibly old, worn smooth in the center as though thousands of feet had passed over it. There was no sound except the soft flutter of pages somewhere below. When I finally started down, the air grew colder. My hand brushed the wall, which felt like stone rather than plaster. The sound of turning pages grew louder, blending with a faint whispering that came and went like a slow tide. The stairs ended in a long corridor lined with iron shelves. They stretched into the dark on both sides, filled not with books, but with stacks upon stacks of catalog cards. They were arranged so tightly the walls themselves seemed to pulse with them. The air was thick with dust, and beneath it a faint metallic tang like blood. In the center of the corridor stood a single desk. Behind it sat the librarian, Mrs. Weaver. Her posture was the same as always, perfectly still, hands folded, head slightly bowed. Her eyes were open and glassy, reflecting the pale light of a flickering bulb overhead. I wanted to turn back, but the way behind me was gone. The staircase had vanished. "You have returned," she said without moving her mouth. The words came from the air itself, dry and weightless. I tried to tell her I didn't take anything. My voice sounded small, hollow. She rose slowly from the chair. The movement was silent, fluid, unnatural. Her eyes never blinked as she stepped toward me. Around her, the shelves began to tremble. Cards slid from their stacks and drifted through the air like ash. Each one that fell made a faint whispering sound, as though speaking its own name before vanishing into the dark. "This place keeps what is forgotten," she said. "Every story, every name, every voice that was borrowed and never returned." The air thickened. The cards swirled around me. brushing against my skin like moth wings. I felt something cold touch the back of my neck. A finger. I turned sharply, but no one was there. When I looked back, Mrs. Weaver stood closer now. Her face was inches from mine. Her eyes filled my vision, bottomless and endless. "You were never meant to leave without paying," she said. I stumbled backward, hitting one of the shelves. The impact sent a cascade of cards raining down. For a moment I could hear them whispering louder, each voice distinct, some crying, others pleading. In their overlapping tones, one phrase repeated again and again. "He took it. He took it. He took it." I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, a weight like invisible hands gripping my ribs. I gasped, unable to breathe. My vision blurred. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Mrs. Weaver's hand reaching toward my face, her fingers stretching wider than they should, her nails pale and thin like paper. When I woke, I was outside the library, lying on a cold pavement. Dawn was breaking. My clothes were covered in dust. My throat was raw, as if I'd been screaming. I stumbled to my feet and looked back at the building. It looked normal again, still quiet and different. But something was wrong. My reflection in the library's glass door didn't match my movements. It blinked when I didn't. And as I walked away, I realized the whispering hadn't stopped. It was inside my head now, faint but constant, like the turning of endless pages just out of reach. Every voice was speaking the same words in unison. One more to be shelved. For weeks I told myself it hadn't happened, that I'd imagined the underground archive, the whispering shelves, the thing that wore the librarian's face. But every night, when the room grew quiet, I could hear it again, the faint turning of pages somewhere just behind the walls. The whisper never stopped. Sometimes it was a single voice, sometimes hundreds blending into one endless hum. Sleep became impossible. Food tasted like paper. Mirrors showed glimpses that didn't match what I felt inside. When I looked too long, I'd see her face flicker through mine, her unblinking stare staring back from my reflection. I moved through days like a ghost, afraid to be awake, terrified to sleep. It was a sound that brought me back to the library, the soft thump against my apartment door late one night. I waited, holding my breath. Another thump. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing but a single brown envelope lying on the floor. Inside it was a library card, my name printed in perfect type. Underneath, a date that hadn't come yet. A due date. The next morning I went back. I don't know why. The streets were empty, and the world felt thinner somehow, as if I was walking through a place that didn't quite remember itself. When the library came into view, I noticed something I hadn't before. The sign above the door was gone. Only faint outlines of the letters remained, like a scar. Inside, it was silent. The air hung heavy with dust, thick enough to taste. The lights were dim, the color of dying sunlight. Every table was empty, every chair perfectly aligned. I called out, but my voice didn't echo. It just vanished, swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw her, Mrs. Weaver, standing behind the front desk, motionless as ever. Her eyes met mine, and that was when I realized she hadn't moved at all since the last time I'd seen her. She was pale and still and cold as stone, dead, yet her eyes were open, and she was watching me. I backed away, but the door behind me no longer led outside. Instead, it opened into another hallway, one I had never seen before. The air beyond it was colder, deeper, darker, and from it came the sound, the same turning of pages, slow and The whispers began again, faint at first, then louder, surrounding me, pressing in from every side. I stepped through. The hallway stretched on forever. Shelves rose high into the dark, stacked with books that looked alive. They pulsed faintly like breathing things. The floor beneath my feet was soft, like old paper soaked in moisture. Every few steps I could hear something scuttle just out of sight. I passed rows of tables, each one occupied. At first I thought they were statues, but as I got closer, I saw faces I recognized. The man from the front desk, the woman who used to clean the aisles. Each sat motionless, staring down at a book that wrote itself, the words appearing slowly across yellowed pages. Their eyes followed the lines, unblinking, lips slightly parted as if whispering what they read. Then I saw my own face among them, my reflection sitting at a table near the end of the room, hands poised over an open book. It turned a page as I watched. I froze. The book was mine. My name was written at the top of every page. The story inside was my life, word for word, leading up to that exact moment. When I turned to look behind me, Mrs. Weaver was there again, but she wasn't breathing. She wasn't moving, and still her voice filled the room. "You must finish what you borrowed." I tried to run. The shelves closed in. Books tumbled from the walls, bursting open as they hit the ground. Inside each one was something alive, eyes, fingers, mouths whispering in unison. The whisper became a scream without sound, and then the lights went out. When I woke, I was sitting at the table, my hands resting on the open book. The ink on the pages was wet, glistening in the dim light. I watched the words form beneath my fingers, writing themselves. They described what I was doing, what I was thinking, what I was seeing. Mrs. Weaver stood behind me, her head tilted, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were hollow now, filled with black ink that bled down her cheeks like tears. She leaned close, her voice a whisper against my ear. "It is written now. You belong to the shelves." I felt something close around my throat, cold and dry like parchment. My vision blurred. The pages in front of me began to ripple, as though something beneath them were breathing. The words twisted and changed shape, forming a single final line. "The last borrower has been cataloged." The next sound I heard was the soft turning of a page. I don't remember leaving the library, but I must have, because I woke up in my apartment again. Only it isn't my apartment anymore. The walls are covered in pages. They move when I breathe. The sound of turning never stops. There's a book on my table, open to the first page. The title written in black ink, "The Librarian Who Doesn't Blink." And the first line is already there, waiting for me to finish it. It says I'm sitting here, writing this. It says I will hear a knock soon. It says that when I open the door, Mrs. Weaver will be waiting, her eyes unblinking, her mouth open wide. And as I look up from the page, I can already hear her footsteps outside.